You're listening to Black Music Scene, a show where we explore the incredible journeys, challenges, and triumphs of Black orchestral musicians who've dedicated their lives to the craft, breaking barriers and defining what it means to be a virtuoso. We are here to celebrate and archive the awe-inspiring stories of our living legends in Black classical music. Today, we're coming to you live from the second annual Black Orchestral Network Summit. And on this special episode, we'll be exploring the obstacles that hinder integration and expression of Black cultural aesthetics in classical music. What do we mean when we talk about authenticity and aesthetics in Black music? How do we continue to bring more Black culture into classical music? What can we learn from those who came before us? We're trying to gain a little more clarity. This is Black Music Scene, cultivating community, lifting our voices, and telling our stories. Thank you. Welcome to another episode of the Black Music Scene podcast. My name is David Norville. For those who don't know me, I'm an oboist, I'm a media producer, and I'm one of the founding members of the Black Orchestral Network. I'm really excited to be here recording another episode of Black Music Scene. This project is definitely one of my favorite things that I've been doing over the last couple years, and to be able to capture stories and highlight experiences of people who are doing the work and playing the music and doing it in a wonderful way is just really rewarding for me. Like I said, today, we are live and in person recording an episode at the second annual Black Orchestral Network Summit. And Black Music Scene is one of the mouthpieces of our organization, serving to lift our voices and tell our stories and archive the experiences of living legends in Black classical music. We've had the privilege to document the stories of people like Ann Hobson Pilot, harpist with the Boston Symphony Orchestra for 40 years, Booker Rowe Jr., violinist with Philadelphia Orchestra for 50 years, Dale Breidenthal, LA, 40 years, people like that. And I'm really privileged and pleased today to be adding two more brilliant folks to our list of episode guests. On stage with us is Dr. Matthew Morrison, Associate Professor in the Clive Davis Institute of Recorded Music at New York University, and Dr. Richard Desinord, Assistant Professor of Music Theory at the Michigan State University College of Music. Please join me in welcoming these gentlemen to the stage.
No, from DC. It's like, nah.
Thank you so much for being here. Thanks for being on the show.
Thank you
for having us.
So I want to start with just background, introductions. If you two can share maybe where you're from, how you got into music, and a bit about your current field of study. Who'd like to go first?
So I am originally from Charlotte, North Carolina. First of all, thank you for this invitation. It's really wonderful to be here in this space with this organization in particular, amongst so many colleagues who I have worked with over the years, and also with folks who I'm meeting anew. And so it's really lovely to be invited in this space to be in conversation with you all about these really significant topics. And as it was stated on the previous panel, these conversations are very important, and just as important that there are people on the inside who are listening to them and actually really sort of adjusting to these some difficult conversations that we are attempting to have, which are really about sustainability in life, right? For people who for quite some time have not been able to have a fair shot at that. So I'm from North Carolina, born and raised in Charlotte. I'm raised as a classically trained violinist, but in church first. I didn't take lessons until my senior year in college when I won senior year in high school when I won the Omega Talent Hunt, and then was offered free lessons by Mr. Leroy Sellers, who was one of the first Black violinists to be in the Charlotte Symphony. I also grew up in the Black church, AME Church in particular. And so one of the things that we talked about sort of in our pre-planning here was how both my upbringing as a classically trained violinist through church and then through the various musical institutions, as well as my upbringing musically in the Black church and growing up listening to contemporary radio, as well as being very much informed by music of the past, Black music of the past in particular, has really sort of shaped and informed my overall relationship as a performer, as a listener, as well as a music historian. Currently, I'm a musicologist, right, whose work focuses on the relationship between music and identity and performance and how that means, right, and then what that sort of suggests for various parts of our lives, society, politics, et cetera.
And same, thanks for the invite. Richard Desinord. I'm from Washington, D.C. Originally, I grew up in the D.C. area. I think I moved out of like the city elementary school and went to PG County. And so I could say I'm DMV resident, PG County resident as well. How I got into music, same as Matthew, I grew up playing in the church. I grew up in a household where both my parents are Haitian immigrants, so I went to both Black American churches and Haitian churches. And my brother and I were like the only musicians in ours. We used to make in a room that was kind of like this, but like maybe an eighth of the size of this room. But yeah, I grew up hearing the music, I grew up playing it, and eventually I started playing in the band at school, elementary school and middle school, and then went on to college. I went to Howard University and I continued doing that. How I got into music theory was, I actually thought it was really fascinating when I was in middle school. I was one of like the only kids who actually liked theory. So it was one of those things where I liked finding patterns and doing math and things like that. And I went on to Howard University, and my professor, Anthony Randolph, Dr. Anthony Randolph, he gave me a journal. He said, if you really want to do this, you need to learn like how to actually write, not like these little papers you do for class, but you need to really learn how to write and to read effectively. And he gave me those tools. I had a teacher in high school that told me, if you really want to do this theory thing, you need to learn how to play piano. So I had to teach myself.
Were you taking AP theory, or were you taking theory offered just in the school?
Yeah, it actually was offered all 4 years. And AP theory was the last year of theory. So Suitland is a very weird environment. It's like the most hood environment in DC outside of Baltimore, but you also have this like really excelling arts program there. So yeah, that's how I basically got into it, and I gave myself some time, partly because I didn't think like I was ready, or I didn't think I was capable. I got that journal from my professor, and he said, yeah, if you want to do this, you have to be able to write like this. So I taught public school for about 3 years, and then kind of on a whim, I just applied to grad school. Here I am, so.
I didn't realize until Richard, how much we have in common there, because I went to Morehouse for undergrad, and it was very much, I think it's important to sort of shaping my own understanding of my relationship to performance and to Black music of various styles in particular. And I also graduated from Morehouse and then taught for 3 years in Atlanta, middle and high school. And then I applied to grad school kind of on a whim to 2 programs, one in conducting and one in musicology. And I say, well, we'll see which one I get into, and I got into the musicology, so there I went. But it wound up being, it wasn't one of those things where, you do this because you can't do. I was just like, I honestly did not know, what was, and I was trying to figure out, and it wound up being that, that program at Catholic University, which was a program that my mentor from Morehouse, Dr. Alfred Duckett, graduated from. And so that kind of followed, his path a bit there to graduate study.
Yeah, I love having you both sort of highlight and detail a little bit about your background, because I think it helps to frame the conversation that I wanted to have today. I wanted to have a conversation about Black musical aesthetics. And when I say, Black musical or Black cultural aesthetics, I'm thinking about, distinct artistic principles, values, and expressions that stem from Black cultural tradition. Things like, our rhythmic complexity, or our call and response, improvisation, emotional expressiveness, the way that we embed our culture and memory in our storytelling, in our music. And I brought a clip that I want to play now to help further contextualize this conversation. So this is a conversation from the Helga podcast between Helga Davis and Dr. Fredera Hadley. Let's hear this clip.
I want to talk too about jazz. I don't understand what's happened to jazz. I can go so many places and never see Black people. at jazz performances, and it breaks my heart every time. And then what I do see is the imitation of life. It is how fast can I play, how many notes can I play, and it is devoid of the history. And so it then is, well, I can play all of John Coltrane's notes. And then it's like, well, so what?
Okay.
And that you have to be more to make more.
What do you have to say? What do you have to say? And I think the two statements you made are related. Not all of what exists in jazz, but a good bit of what is celebrated in jazz is as you describe. And I think that's never really going to resonate with Black audiences.
Ah,
You see what I'm saying?
I hadn't thought of that.
Because what we know about Black musical aesthetics is that my advisor, Portia Moss, but she talks about this idea of aliveness in the music. Whatever you're performing, people, Black audiences, need to believe that you mean it, that you're saying it. It's easy to point out gospel music and genres, like the emotive part of it is not extra. It's an essential part of it. So if you're any kind of musician and it feels simply something that you are resurrecting from the past without imbuing it with your own story, that's not gonna work. It's just not.
Mic drop moment there from Dr. Fredera Hadley. And that's a clip that I've been thinking about and has been sitting with me for about like 5 months now, since we recorded it back in whenever we recorded it. And I think about that clip as somebody doing the work to continuously trying to bring more Black people into this space, into this so-called classical space. I think about that clip in the context of somebody who's interested in programming so-called classical music that resonates with Black audiences. And it makes me think, well, what does enthrall Black audiences traditionally, culturally, psychologically? And I sit here in this chair and I think maybe I'm not equipped yet with the language to describe the elements of these Black cultural aesthetics, which makes me so excited to speak to both of you. And I kind of just want to get, firstly, just live reactions. How do you react to hearing that clip? And how do you kind of react to what I just said?
I think an initial reaction for me reminds me of when I did my master's degree at Penn State, and I remember a friend of mine, Brent Burkhead, who's a jazz saxophonist out of Howard University, but I think he plays around New York City, Baltimore, and he came and did a master class with the jazz band at Penn State, who at the time, I don't know if it's still like that, but was an all-white jazz band, and one of the students asked him, how do we become better jazz musicians? And one of the things that stood out to me was that he told them that you need to know the good and the bad, that this music comes from a people, that it comes from a history. And a lot of them, he was asking them questions about just like typical things in Black history around Black arts. And they couldn't answer a thing, but they could tell you the notes. They could play everything. And it was, you could see the students, it was just like, they looked crestfallen, like they didn't know what to say next to that. He didn't say it as a form of admonishment. He was telling them or encouraging them to understand that this history is complex, that a lot of what is beautiful about Black art comes from, pain, suffering. And if you don't know that, it's a disingenuous approach to engaging with the art form, because you could play a few notes or you could play a few chords or a few rhythmic patterns. So that's something that comes to mind like immediately.
My reaction to hearing that clip of Helga Davis and Dr. Fredera Hadley, Fredera is a dear friend and colleague of mine of many years, and so we think along very similar lines, right? And Helga Davis is a brilliant, amazing artist and cultural worker who I've had the opportunity to work with. And hearing, I can also hear the subtext in their conversation as well, right? What's both said and what's unsaid. But something that strikes me is another connection in this sort of nexus of Black music scholars and performers with Fredera and Helga, and that's Guy Ramsey, Dr. Guy Ramsey, who was also a mentor of both for Darren and now Professor Emeritus at the University of Pennsylvania, in black music in particular. And there's a recent colloquy in American music in tribute to Ramsey's book, Who Hears Here, which is a compilation of essays he's written over time. And much of Ramsey's work has to do with writing about black music, but also the historiography of black music and how black music fits into the larger canon of musicological and music studies, and then what that sort of says about performance and black music performance. And one of the things that I took the opportunity to do there was to ask a question about what does it mean to absorb black music study into the academy, as the academy remains anti-black, as the academy sort of privileges particular people to study these works and present them to the larger public over others, specifically black folks, right? What does it mean that black people continue to suffer the brunt of various levels of violence and structural oppression as their musics and their studies and things become to build entire careers, right, in the academy? What is your relationship to that? I asked that of myself as a black person, right? Who has a tenured job at NYU and has written a book around these subjects. What is my relationship to this work, and how is this work part of a larger liberatory process? So I also asked that of musicians, and we tend, for some reason, not to, because we somehow think of music as this abstracted form that has a sort of, the abstraction also allows for music to be seen as sort of an object to be commodified and used and taken up for one's own purposes, without thinking about the people and the bodies that they come from. And so, I asked that question even of musicians: what is your relationship to the foundation, the performers of this music, and the people who they come from, who continue to have to deal with levels of repression as you benefit from that in your career, your personal life, your identity, your family, and everything else?
I want to actually go a little bit deeper, Dr. Morrison, because you mentioned your book. You recently released a book called Black Sound that explores the sonic history of blackface minstrelsy and the racial foundations of American musical culture from the early 1800s through the turn of the 20th century. And I think the book, its concept and the research is largely relevant here in this conversation. So I would love for you to talk about this research, talk to us about why you developed and continue to develop this concept of Black Sound.
Yeah, thanks for asking it. I'll make this as brief as possible. So Black Sound is a concept I developed in graduate school that is defined most simply as the sonic and embodied aesthetic legacy of blackface minstrelsy that serves as the sonic, cultural, political, and property basis of all American popular music entertainment at large, okay? That sounds like a overstatement, but it ain't. And I wrote a whole book to make sure, to be clear, that we understand that, okay? So the thing about me coming into thinking about the sort of impact of popular music in making racial identity and making culture and making American nationalism and making sort of how we understand the development of copyright laws and property laws and the way that music circulates as a commodity, right? I really came to that by way of my entry point as a black performing, classically trained musician who also, like many, many black musicians who've been performing classical music as long as classical music has been called such, right, in existence in a way, have always sort of traversed multiple styles of music. We were talking about that, how, now everybody's got to be a hustler, right, in the classical music world because the jobs are thin across the board. Well, black folks, my colleagues, people who I know, been doing that a long time, right? And I don't mean just hustle, but I mean like moving and navigating between various musical spaces at the highest caliber, right? One, because one is not allowed to really make a career just in one lane. And so that goes back to how black people often are expected to sound, expected to look, expected to perform within these larger white supremacist structures that develop out of slavery, that have in many ways contained, determined, and have shaped how we understand people are, what their sort of authentic performances and sounds are. So one of the reasons it's very difficult for people at large to imagine that classical music is, quote, natural to black people is because of the legacy of blackface, right? Because blackface has for decades and decades and decades and decades and decades from its invention in the 1820s and even before, various forms of black racial mimicry have just embedded. We can think about how significant social media is in shaping our perceptions of other people, especially if we have limited to no relationships to those people in our day-to-day lives. And we see through studies that people live, within their own racialized demographics still, at large within this country. And so there are just, several ways I think that both the development of blackface and the way that it shapes and impacts the larger American musical economy, but also the way that it shapes people's expectations of how people are supposed to sound, also directly shapes why it's been difficult for black musicians in the classical world to be taken seriously. Because when you have Elizabeth Taylor Greenfield, right, who is touring at the turn of the 20th century, singing all of the, at the top level, all of this operatic repertoire, but also having to sing Stephen Foster blackface songs because the audience that she's performing to is a white audience as well, and that's what they're expecting of black performers. And you got to sell a ticket if you want people to buy it. Okay, and we see that happen. Listen, I could talk about what's happening today in various ways, but I'm gonna leave that for right now.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah. Love the energy that is here on the stage. I love the breadth of knowledge, the breadth of experience, the breadth of consciousness here. And hearing you talk just now reminded me of some of the work recently I've done. I remember there's a show I worked on called Every Voice, which was an exploration of 4 very popular operas and their depictions of blackness in those operas. So we're looking at Aida, we're looking at Otello, Abduction from the Seraglio, and particularly the Magic Flute. And we're looking at the ways that those shows were created and brought to the United States at a time where the American minstrel landscape was quite fertile.
Yeah.
People were looking for that kind of work. And so thinking about just how deep it goes as we continue to try to bridge this cognitive dissonance, or at least perceived cognitive dissonance,
Right.
Between what it means to be black and what it means to play so-called classical music. It's continuously interesting for me. And to think about what Lady Jess was saying a little earlier today, like sometimes you just want to play, man. Sometimes you just want to play, and you don't want to have to deal with all that comes along with it. You want to be able to play and be able to express what you have, and that might be your pain and your sorrow. Dr. Desinord, I want to kick it to you and ask you a question about some of your work. So as a theorist, you focus on the particulars of expression as it comes out structurally in pieces of music. So I'm curious to know, what continues to puzzle you or interest you about black cultural expression and the way that it's embodied in music?
Yeah, so right now, one of the biggest things I've been looking at is how black music is shaped by black rhetoric. Like my dissertation in my first article that's forthcoming is on a particular turn that gospel keyboardists always do. And essentially I link it to the concept of people co-signing in sentences when they're speaking and things like that. But for me, with music theory, everybody knows when you think about theory, you think about a bunch of rules that you have to follow. You think about the textbooks and all that stuff. And what I've tried to do, or something that continuously puzzles me, is how do we codify something like black art? I saw recently that Henry Louis Gates was trying to come out with a dictionary for like AAVE or black language. And I remember thinking, there's a reason why this stuff has evolved into what it is right now. I think about one of the last black art forms that has not been codified, which is black gospel. Most other forms of music have been overtaken within the popular music sphere. And I think that black gospel has been allowed to evolve the way it has because no one has academicized it. It hasn't been put in a textbook. But then after that, I think about what kept me from the field for a bit, which was that I didn't see people that looked like me trying to do this with our art form. If I were to ask anybody in this room, how many of you have ever had a black music theory professor or knew somebody with a terminal degree in black or in music theory? Actually, let's try that. How many people have had a black music theory professor?
Well, I went to Morrison.
Yeah, and there's a lot of people in here that went to school for music. Yeah, if you went to an HBC, you definitely had one, but it's not. I went to a conference, and my first conference with music theory, I think it was maybe 1,000 people registered, and I could count maybe on one or two hands how many black people there were in music theory. I think it's right now, maybe I can think of 10 people that have terminal degrees in it.
Yeah.
And the reason why I say that is a lot of times we talk about, diversifying the arts, getting people into orchestras, and that is a big deal. I'm not going to take that away. It's the title of the conference. But one of the things that usually doesn't get that much attention, we kind of talked about on the last panel, which is the people behind the scenes or on the other side that's not being performers. And I'm talking really about us two and people who are in our fields on the academic side. When you put things into textbooks, when you put things into curriculum outside of just concert program, that stuff matters to people. For me, I never saw examples of black composers in theory books. I never saw examples brought up in class beyond undergrad. My teacher, he would definitely break out like a gospel tune during theory class, but for the most part, we don't see that stuff in there. And I'm always of two minds where I'm torn between, do we codify this thing and do we write it out? Because somebody's gonna then take it and read it and think they're an expert without actually engaging with the tradition. So I can write a book about how to play gospel keyboard or R&B harmony or analyzing a gospel. I even teach these things at Michigan State. But I always start my class and I end with, you've taken this course, but you are not an expert in it. You took my analysis of gospel music course, but none of you have visited a black church before. You haven't been embedded in that community. And it's never going to be something that just lives on the page. It's never going to be this thing that is in the textbook. So again, my mind is always wafting between, how far do I go with codification? What are the ethics of codification? If I take something that hasn't been written down, what do I actually want to say about this in a way that does not give people license to essentially just take it and say, okay, now I know everything. So it's always this weird tussle. And I'll end with this. Again, we need more people at that table of academia who are speaking about these stories, who are writing about the history, who are analyzing, who can really speak to it from a perspective that's not just like mechanical. And for me, when I'm looking at it in that kind of way, I see it a lot of times within my students. I see students who aren't used to seeing us in those spaces. I had a student when I was at Eastman, I did a summer program somewhere at Eastman. I had a high school student that said, he met me and he asked me what I did. And I said, I'm a PhD student in music theory. And he said, you don't look like a theory professor. Like, he just told me, and it was so matter of fact. But then I had to think about the fact that I've had people, even classmates at Howard, when they find out what I'm doing, they're like, oh yeah, we don't do that. Or I didn't know we did that. And it was something that was like in my own mind when I was, contemplating going along this journey, which was that I didn't see people that looked like me doing it, or people that when it comes to the academic part of music, again, it's not a lot of us having those conversations, especially on the theory side. So making sure that, we have more faces, more perspectives to be able to talk about this thing, so that students know it's okay to read. It's okay that, we can do these technical things. We don't have to just be performers, although that's very important.
Certainly. One of the things that strikes me is, as you're talking about, this pulling, this tension, this conundrum of how far you might want to codify something, it just reminds me how precious it is, the culture and the music and the stakes that we're sort of reckoning with. And we mentioned Mr. Guthrie Ramsey before, and I actually want to play a clip, because in our prep, we talked, I think both of you brought up Guthrie Ramsey and talked about his influence on you. And so I wanted to play another clip and keep the conversation going from there.
Here's what I think is the problem, and it has to do with these practices in pedagogy when it comes to music and art. And that is, it's on the professor, it's on the writer to show that art music, whatever you consider art music to be, is not only these abstract principles of complexity and abstraction and difficulty and challenging, but it also has a social life. And then conversely, we have to show that the pop realm is not just function. It's got these other kind of layers of complexities. But I think that in some people's writings and in some people's teaching, they try to keep them totally separate.
So that's a quote from the music historian, pianist, and composer Guthrie Ramsey talking about bridging art music and popular music in academic spaces. And I bring it up because I feel as though continuously as we're thinking about, where I started the conversation, how we're bringing in more and more of these Black idioms and Black cultural practices and musical aesthetics into the space, it requires the degradation of certain barriers in our language, certain barriers cognitively, and so on. And I would love to know, for both of you, how did you first come into contact with or knowing of Guthrie Ramsey, and how has he influenced your work?
Since I guess I think I'm older. I met Guthrie Ramsey. I smiled when I hear his voice because he feels like an uncle. He feels like one of my uncles. But I met Guthrie Ramsey in 2007 when I was applying to doctoral programs, actually, at a conference in American Musicological Society conference, joint conference with S&T, actually, that year. And I met him at a conference on a panel with George Lewis, who wound up being my advisor at Columbia, and Elie Hassama, and there was a conference on race and in music. This is 2007, right? And he was on the panel, and I was like, and so he was on the panel, George Limpel, Elie Hassama, Charles Atkinson, and as they were all talking, I was like, wow, they're talking my talk, even though I don't know what's going on here. Never been to a music conference. This is really, really white. People are really weird. I don't know what's happening. Now I'm one of those weird people, Honestly, I've become one But at any rate, when I heard and saw Ramsey, I was like, okay. And it was clear to me that he was a brilliant, take no nonsense Black man, right? And I was like, okay, there's a model. And his politics were clear from the start. And I've also witnessed Dr. Ramsey grow as a scholar and a thinker over the years, and he was already tenured and senior when I met, right? And now he's emeritus, and now he is doing mostly performance and being with his beautiful grandchildren. And he retired. A lot of professors stay working until they can't work anymore. He retired, at a good age. So there's just so many things, but it's really also the clarity with which he talked about Black music historiography, right, as its own discourse, but also within the larger systems and structures of politics within the United States and in Black music and in musical practice and study. And for me, Ramsey never separated the practice, right, from the theory, both in his own work as well as a performer. And for me, that was instructive because, as you pointed out, those two things are often separated in how we think through and how we are sort of have to navigate, those worlds. And again, as a Black, classically trained musician who grew up, amongst various styles of Black music, the things were just never separate for me. I never took Stevie Wonder less seriously than I took Beethoven, and I was listening to both of them when I was like 7. You know what I mean? They were both or hearing Nina Simone's voice alone. I could be just as pulled by that and hear things as I would hear, listening to Itzhak Perlman play the chaconne. And again, these are things I'm thinking about as a small child, but not really, I'm not thinking about them, but I am responding to them in the same way. And then I'm able to sort of, as I've developed a language and a sort of larger historical understanding of how these things get separated, allow myself to sit in the sort of tension of how they overlap and just be comfortable with that rather than allow myself to sort of move into the sort of mainstream acceptance that allows one to kind of navigate the scene easier.
Yeah, my experience with Ramsey, I don't know him. He's not an uncle. But I came across his work. I think the first thing that I saw from him was his book, Race Music. I eventually even programmed it into my syllabus. And have my students reading through his work along with others. We were talking about how this is an all-male panel, but some of the biggest names in our field within musicology or academic study of music have been, the leading voices have been women.
Yeah.
I'm thinking of people like Eileen Southern, who's probably one of the giants or the biggest one in the field, Portia Maltsby, Fredar Hadley's advisor, and Melanie Burnham, others like that. Yeah. But yeah, I came across Ramsey's work, and I remember I was struck by how he started off with like personal stories. He talked about being back home, being at a cookout, things like that, and that fueled his understanding of how to both understand and how to communicate his analysis of gospel, not gospel, but black art. So that was like my first foray into his work, and it really shaped how I teach the music. So I taught a course, or I am teaching a course on analysis of R&B and soul. We just finished up a week on soul music. So we kind of go chronologically for about 9 or 10 weeks, and then we break it up, and then we really get into the nitty gritty with like harmony and rhythm and groove and things like that. But yeah, we just finished up a unit on soul, and you know, I told my students at the beginning of the semester, we are going to have uncomfortable conversations. You see on your registration for this class theory, but we are going to talk about the history of it too. I'm not just going to play Nina Simone or Curtis Mayfield or something like that. We are going to get into, again, why the music was created in the first place. We can't separate it out. And I had only one student, and when I taught this course a year ago, put in the syllabus that it was too much, not syllabus, the evaluation said it was too much reading.
Hey.
It's like, you're a grad student, it's 3 credits, you can read 30 pages in a week. But yeah, it was one of those things where I put it in there and I told them, okay, you have to, like, you really have to understand where this music comes from. So when we get in class and we can talk about the chord progressions and the form and verse chorus and pre-chorus and all of that, but I want to get into, again, the why of the music. It doesn't really, because anybody could come in and just, you know, press play on the recorder and do this, but you know, why is this music out here? Why is it existing? And who are the people who are continuing with these traditions? So whether it's soul or neo-soul, why do we have that in there? Because you'll have students not really understand context, and they'll make comments. They won't really understand the history, or even if you give them enough. I remember when I taught the course a year ago, the R&B course, and I do a week on slow jams and sensuality within music, and we were watching Love Jones, and we were talking about, the use of—
Theory class.
Yeah, definitely. No, it started because a student saw a playlist I had, and I decided to change it around. They said, okay, what's that playlist, Slow Jams? And I said, you know what that is. But I decided to make like a larger week out of it. But one of the things that came up in the movie Love Jones, if you've ever seen it, was there's a scene where, and the students picked up on it, and it came in the Guthrie Ramsey book. He talks about how hip hop was used only in the scenes to portray like an antagonist.
Just like in Black Panther.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it was one of those things, yeah, Killmonger is like trap music, you only hear that when you see his character, but yeah, one of the students picked up on it, but he asked the question, he said, you know, that's a black film score who's a music director who's doing this, and you also have a black director and a black cast. He said by them making that decision to use hip hop in a negative way, isn't that black on black crime? And I remember I had to just like, it's one of those things where I was thankful to be able to check him in the class, and I did it in a like a PhD way. I was able to check him way, but it was one of those things where I understood, like, if we didn't have that moment to have that conversation and to contextualize. First, I just told him that word or that term has never been used in a positive way and never will be.
Exactly.
And then we went on from there and got into it. And
has he ever heard of white on white crime?
Exactly. Yeah. We went into all of that, but it's one of those things where, again, if you don't talk about the history, you can't talk about the actual music. Like, I'm not teaching any theory course, even when my form classes I'm doing now. If I put up Florence Price, we are talking about that. We're talking about, you know, the venues that she couldn't play in and what this music means and themes that she uses.
Yes.
Not just saying, oh, she used a pentatonic scale, but why do we do that? Or, I don't know, why does McDonald's always use pentatonic scales in their commercials? I don't know. But that sort of thing comes up a lot. So watch it. You'll see what I'm talking about.
I just heard it.
Yeah. So yeah, that's kind of what Ramsey makes me think about, connecting a lot of these things.
Yeah.
Wow. We're rounding out our time here. Dr. Morrison, I want to just kick it to you one last time. Any closing remarks, closing thoughts that you have to share with us?
Geez Louise. Yeah, this is very important work. I was just talking to just before this. I'm trying to figure out, speaking with Yoon, and how do we continue to do this work as we move expeditiously towards a society and a government that is very clearly trying to quiet and quell certain people and voices and structures and changes, right? How do we ask certain questions in orchestral auditions when affirmative action is illegal? It's real, and we have to get people to care, but I don't know how to make somebody care about a human being if they don't give a fuck about a human being. I don't know, that's not an end, I'm sorry.
No, but I think we get the point. That's a mic
feel
for sure.
I believe we should wrap it up with a final
Yeah.
No, I mean, to round up my part of the conversation, hopefully with a higher note, but
Okay.
and that's a theory term, but no. I mean, I would just say if you know people if you know people who are interested in the academic pursuit of expressing music, not just through the staff and notes and putting things on the page as a composer or as a performer, but someone who wants to be able to write, to be able to read about music in effective ways, and to be able to disseminate that information to other people, I would say encourage that. If they say, okay, I don't want to perform, I want to write, we need more people in the field to be able to do that. We need it because we need those faces to be visible. I didn't know this when I got to Penn State. This is my third year. The students made a comment in passing about how excited they were when the announcement went up and my face went up as like a new hire, that they finally had a professor, not just that looked like them, but that had a lot of the same background. So I think it's really important that we do have more musicology/music history professors, more music theory professors, more ethnomusicology professors that reflect what's going on. Right now, we don't have it. You have people writing about our art form like rap. Most of the leading scholars within the academy are not Black that talk about this stuff. And so you get articles like one that a student brought to me excitedly. I said, hey, this article is about how hip hop and disability go together. And I've seen a few of those, but the author was talking essentially about how disability is something to achieve in hip hop, essentially around that. You can go and find it, but he was using the example, I'll end with this, he used the example of West Coast artists saying it's like scissor, and he said that that's supposed to be mimicking like disability. And I said, no, because Kanye West he had his mouth wired shut when he wrote Through the Wire, and he said like that could drive the same man Dizzard. But I'm like, he is things from West Coast artists that say scissor and things like that. But he said that because his mouth was closed, that's why he couldn't say the word. So that's what we have when we don't have us in the room doing these things. So I don't know that.
Yeah.
Thank you. We'll have to leave it there. Can I have one more round of applause, please? Thank you.